Okay, so it's shooting. Hi, Betty. What are you holding there?
Tell him, Bob.
Well, okay, this drawing was made by a cowboy who rescued, he says in the writing, that rescued these two young lawyers. One of them was Temple Houston. The other one is Charles Swindoll. Of course, Temple Houston was well known as the son of Sam Houston, well-known character in northwestern Oklahoma and Woodward for many years. Charles Swindoll later became a district judge in Enid, Oklahoma. Was there for many years, and my father, who was a court reporter, worked for him. And at some point, there's also a note on it signed by Sam Houston, giving it to the Honorable Judge Swindoll in 1921. And later, Judge Swindoll apparently gave it to my father, who had it, and I found it in the garage, just laying on a shelf, and so I reframed it, and I think it's a part of Oklahoma history, and we will have to donate it to the museum at some point.
Why don't you hold it for a minute, Bob? So I'm too close to get both of you in the same shot. Could Bob hold it for a minute over there? Just hand it to Bob, and I'll get him with it, and then I'll Pam.
And we didn't tell him the judges often had to swim which was that,
Well,
South Canadian or?
Yeah, the pictures of these two lawyers swimming the flooded river to get to court, and the cowboy who drew the picture is shown in the picture riding along on his horse with a rope to throw to them to help save them.
And the swimmer there is Sam Houston, the famous Sam Houston's son.
Temple Houston.
Temple.
Yes, Temple Houston and Charles Swindoll are in the water swimming.
And then the Sam Houston that signed the back there, the piece in the bottom right corner, maybe Temple's son, maybe?
I don't know whether it might be Sam Houston's son or it might be Temple Houston's son. In other words, if he were Sam Houston's son, he would be Temple Houston's brother. So, and I don't know what his relationship is.
Okay. And you were born in the same year, in 21, you said.
What's that?
You were born the same year.
I was born in 1921 when Sam Houston signed this and gave it to Judge Swindoll. And
you said you met Judge Swindoll too.
Oh yeah,
you knew him.
I knew him. I'd be up in the office, or he and Dad would be driving the car and I'd be riding with him. So although I was quite young, I knew him, and he was a really nice, interesting gentleman.
Ended up on the Supreme Court.
And yeah, then later he was appointed, became a member of the Oklahoma Supreme Court, and left Enid at that time.
I was telling Betty, I just can't imagine lawyers wearing wet suits all day, you know, that they walk into the courtroom with a wet suit.
You wonder, don't you, what happened to all their papers?
Yeah.
I didn't see them holding them up.
They didn't have plastic. They had something, I know. They must have had something that would be protective.
Oh, and they must have been on horseback. And so So I don't know what happened to their horses.
1921, they had cars.
This wasn't in 1921.
Okay.
It was given to him in 21.
It was
But
because in 1921, why Swindoll was a judge. This is when he was a young lawyer.
Okay.
I don't know, we can look up and see what year Temple Houston died, but he was died as a young man. I don't know, he may have been shot. He was always getting in gun battles.
and you lived in your family lived in Woodward?
What's that?
Your family lived in Woodward?
Temple Houston did.
Okay. Okay. You lived in Enid, didn't
But
you?
we lived in Enid.
That whole time. Yeah. You were pretty much raised in Enid?
Yeah, I was about 12 or 13 when we moved from there to Oklahoma City.
Okay, Betty's turn.
My turn.
Why don't you tell me, before we run out of memory, why don't you tell, we could pick on her about her airplane experiences.
Yeah.
You have two stories.
Well, back in the Depression days, Daddy was very fond of airplanes, always, and interested in airplanes, and knew Wiley Post and was a friend of his. And so Daddy would go to the airport and walk up and down the hangars at the Will Rogers Airport. At that time, the hangars were open and anybody could go walk in them. And we were out, we did this frequently. And when he was going out there, I'd go with him because I like to look at airplanes too. So anyway, we were walking around one day and Wiley Post was there working on the Winnie Mae. And Daddy stopped and talked to him and visited with him for about maybe a half an hour or so. And I was in awe because I knew who he was and what all he had done at that point. And I must have been 8 or 10 years old, somewhere in there. And so I was pretty impressed at meeting Wiley Post and seeing the Winnie Mae. And so finally he looked at me and he said, "Would you like to get in the Winnie, sit up in the cockpit?" And I said, "Yes." And so he just picked me up and put me up in the cockpit. And I sat there for maybe 10 minutes or so looking it over and taking it all in and thoroughly enjoying it. And so he lifted me out and put me back down on the floor. But that was a real experience to me. And then the other airplane experience I had was about 6 years old. And we lived in Shawnee, but we spent every weekend in Oklahoma City with Daddy's folks. So we were driving home one day, and there was a sign on the side of the road that said, "Airplane rides for so much, a half an hour." So Daddy just wheeled off into the field, and it was an open cockpit airplane. So Mother and I stuffed in the back seat and fastened in and put leather helmets on our heads and took off and flew in an open cockpit airplane for a half an hour, came back and landed, and Daddy got in and took his flight. We went on into Shawnee and went home. But I thought that was pretty neat too, because that was my first time I'd been into an airplane, and I was really thrilled about that.
So between your 6-year-old airplane ride and open cockpit, and then your dad talking about Wiley Post, by the time you actually got to meet Wiley Post when you were 8 or 10, you knew about Wiley Post and what it was all about.
I knew all about him. I knew everything he had ever done in airplanes. Daddy didn't know him before he was into airplanes and didn't pay much attention to him. But I knew everything he had done with the air and in the airplanes. He'd gone up in Adams. Where did he go up? And he had a space suit.
I remember high altitude.
Yeah, high altitudes, above the regular end of the altitude. And he had and they basically took his air suit, and that was the basis for the air suit that they made for the astronauts and went to further space thing. But they took his airplane out of the Smithsonian and checked it over to see what he had in it. And of course, it wasn't anything like as sophisticated as they used. But then he didn't go very far up. But he did all this in the Winnie Mae, which was amazing.
And what was your impression of the Winnie Mae again? You told me before that you remembered what color it was, maybe,
I remember lots of red inside.
inside.
That's all I remember about it. And lots of buttons and lots of things I didn't dare touch. But I just sat there with my hands in my lap looking around because I was afraid I'd hit the wrong thing.
And it wasn't much after that that he.
It was just a few years after that he was killed.
That was, and Will Rogers at the same time. So the whole nation was mourning.
I was in Washington, D.C., and they used to have what they call the man on the street, where there'd be an announcer who would ask people questions. He'd stop people on the street and say, "What do you think about so-and-so?" So we were getting up that morning and turned the radio on, and he was saying, "What do you think about the death of Wiley Post and Will Rogers?" And so it had just happened, and so we of course were dismayed at that. But we had an appointment that afternoon to go see our U.S. Senator from Oklahoma named Josh Lee, and so we were in his office, and the reporter from the Senate came in with a speech he'd given that morning in memory of Will Rogers and Wiley Post. So he stood there, and he had been a drama teacher before he became a senator. And very dramatically he read what he had said in the Senate, proofreading what they had. And so it was a pretty memorable experience to have him reading in speech while we were standing there.
Standing where? In the.
And you could look out and see the state capitol.
Well, I picture that. I picture standing there, and here's a window in the Capitol. I don't know whether that was true or not, but that's in my picture I have. Make it more dramatic.
But it was in Washington, you said?
Well, yeah, we were in his office in Washington,
in D.C. So the national capital.
Yes.
What were you doing up there?
We just went up on vacation.
Both of you?
No,
No. You didn't know each other yet.
We didn't know it. I didn't know him then.
No.
That was way before my time.
Well, those are great stories. Thanks.
We were both at the World Fair in Chicago in 1934. Not at the same time, but we were both there.
As kids. Yeah. Just about Wiley Post again. He had his patch over his eye, and just there was no mistaking him. And it was just down at the open hangar.
Yeah. Oh yeah, he was just out at the hangar. He kept his airplane there when he wasn't flying it, and he was out there working on his plane that Sunday, and checking it over for something. Maybe he was going to go on another trip or something. I didn't get it. He and Daddy talked for about a half an hour. I don't remember of anything they were talking about.
He was quite a character. He was
an honorary character.
Yeah, he was spent some time in prison for holding people up. He would get on a lonely stretch of highway and forgotten what he did, but anyway, he got people to stop, and then he would rob them. And the Winnie Mae was never his plane; it belonged to somebody else. But he flew for this rich person, and so it was essentially his plane. And according to his biography, he really screwed up and caused the accident in Alaska that killed him.
Oh.
two or three things in a row that were bad. The plane they were in, he designed more or less, put different parts together. He got a heavier motor and put in this frame of this plane, and he changed the wings, and it was a low wing plane, and they went up that, and they put the floats on it, and went up to Alaska and landed in the lakes, and he was in this town, and there was a pilot there that he knew, that they were good friends, and it was foggy, and he was planning on taking off the next morning, and this pilot says, "No, don't do it." He says, "It's going to be foggy all the way, and you're liable to get lost. Don't leave now, wait another day." But Wiley Post got up the next morning and flew out anyway, and this guy was dismayed when he found out they'd left. And sure enough, they were lost. And another thing, he had 2 or 3 different gasoline tanks on it, some temporary rigs. And the one of main one didn't have any float or anything to show when it was empty. And he'd just wait till the motor started sputtering, and then he'd switch to another tank. And so anyway, they were lost, and finally they were flying along the shoreline and saw some people down below, so they landed, and there was some Indians and some natives, and they got directions on which direction to go to find where they wanted to be. And they were taking off, and the motor sputtered, and the plane just dove back down into the water, and they probably drowned.
Oh.
I didn't know all that.
I know you didn't.
One of the books you've read.
What?
One of the books you've read. The biography.
Yeah, it was a biography by some people that I think admired him, and they never did say it's his fault. But you know, by listing all of those things, you know, that actually went on for a few months building the plane and doing all of this. They all added up, and it was an awkward, unbalanced plane, and with temporary fuel tanks and things.
Did either one of you ever see Will Rogers?
No. But she's related to Will Rogers.
Well, my aunt was down to Clyda, my daddy's sister, was talking one time about them going up to Chickasha to a family picnic, a family reunion thing. And there was a kid there doing rope tricks. His name was Will. And he was a long-distance cousin of theirs. That was all I know. But he did all these real fancy rope tricks at their family reunion. And she got home and she asked her mother who that kid was. And she says, he's somebody's son and his name is Will. So she was just always wondering if that happened to be Will Rogers, but we never knew for sure. And no one ever traced it down to find out. But anyway, so that's the closest I can claim to being a relative of his.
What's the family name? What was the family name?
I don't even know that.
Okay.
I'm not sure what the family name was.
Was it, well, as long as we're doing
It
Oklahoma.
was in Chickasha, though. It was at a ranch, and I think it was at their house, the kid's house, but which was in Chickasha. But that's all I know.
Any other famous Oklahoman stories? As
No.
long as we're not talking. I'm not even getting into our family.
My grandmother, my father's mother, told me we were watching an 89ers Day parade. They used to have 89ers Day parades all the time and every year. And the wagon went by with Oklahoma or bust on it. And she says, that's the exact same wagon that we left Kentucky and headed for Oklahoma in when I was a kid. And she said, and it had Oklahoma for bust on it, painted on it. And they ended up in Texas visiting some relatives, and her father died. So her mother just stayed there, and a few years later her mother died. And then after her mother died, she was a young teenager, I think. And she came to Oklahoma Indian Territory to stay with an aunt and uncle who were missionaries in the Indian Territory. And they raised her then till she was grown. And the only thing I know, the lady, her aunt that raised her was Aunt Betty. And Grandma took very close touch with her, and they wrote and saw each other. And Aunt Betty had come up to Oklahoma City and visit us when I was a kid. And I'd met her several times and really liked her. But that's all I know for sure.
Do you think of any other Oklahoma celebrities to tell me about? Any other Oklahoma history?
Dad and your grandfather came down.
Yeah, he settled it down south of Lawton. They, for that area, instead of having a run, they had a drawing. And the drawing was done in El Reno. And they had applications for land from everywhere, letters, and they put them all in a big 6-foot square box, and then just drew the letters out. The first one out got first choice, and etc. So